I never thought a backyard shed would land me in the middle of a neighborhood war, but here I was, standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, watching a code enforcement officer photograph my property while my neighbor, Wendy Rothman, stood on her lawn with her arms crossed and the smuggest expression I had ever seen on a human face. My name is Jake Nelson, and I had been living in Meadowbrook Estates in Scottsdale, Arizona for 3 years. It was one of those planned communities where every house looked vaguely similar, where the HOA had rules about everything from mailbox colors to the acceptable height of your grass, and where retired people with too much time on their hands appointed themselves the neighborhood watch. I should have known better than to build a shed without going through the proper channels. But honestly, I thought a simple 10 by 12 storage shed in my backyard would fly under the radar. I was wrong. The code enforcement officer, a middle-aged man named Dan Rodriguez according to his badge, walked around my shed with a clipboard, making notes and taking pictures from multiple angles. My shed was nothing fancy, just a prefabricated wooden structure I had assembled over 2 weekends to store my lawn equipment, tools, and camping gear. It sat about 15 feet from my back fence, painted a neutral gray that matched my house trim. "Mr. Nelson," Dan said, not looking up from his clipboard, "did you pull a permit for this structure?" "I didn't think I needed one," I said honestly. "It's not attached to the house and it's under 120 square feet. In Scottsdale, any structure over 100 square feet requires a permit," he explained, still writing. "This looks like it's right at the threshold. I'll need to measure it precisely." I watched him pull out a measure tape and document the exact dimensions, 10 feet by 12 feet, 120 square feet exactly. He made several more notes before walking the perimeter of my yard, checking setbacks from property lines. Wendy was still standing on her lawn, watching the whole thing like it was her personal entertainment. She was 52, divorced, and had been the president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA for the past 6 years. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled. She wore yoga pants and designer tops like they were business suits. And she had made it her life's mission to ensure every single rule in our neighborhood was followed to the letter. The irony was that I had always followed the rules. My grass was always cut to the approved height. My garbage cans were never visible from the street except on collection days. I had even painted my front door the exact shade of acceptable brown from the HOA's approved color palette. But 2 months ago, Wendy and I had gotten into a dispute over my plans to install solar panels on my roof. She claimed they were not aesthetically pleasing and would bring down property values. I had gone ahead anyway after getting approval from the Architectural Review Committee, and Wendy had voted against it. Ever since, she had been looking for any excuse to make my life difficult. "I'm going to need to come back with more equipment," Dan said, walking back toward me. "There are some concerns about the setback from your property line, and I need to verify the height clearances. I'll be back tomorrow morning at 9. In the meantime, do not make any changes to the structure." "Can I ask who filed the complaint?" I already knew the answer, but I wanted to hear it officially. Dan glanced at his paperwork. The complaint came from Wendy Rothman at 847 Meadowlark Drive. She's listed as the HOA president and indicated there were multiple violations of both HOA covenants and city code. I looked over at Wendy, who had the decency to at least turn away and pretend to inspect her rosebushes. The woman had called code enforcement on me over a storage shed that was barely visible from the street and that literally nobody else in the neighborhood had complained about. After Dan left, I went inside and made myself a strong cup of coffee. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from frustration. I had saved for 6 months to afford that shed, and I had spent 2 full weekends assembling it in the brutal Arizona heat. The thought that I might have to tear it down because I had missed some bureaucratic step made my blood boil. I called my friend Marcus Webb, who was a contractor and knew the local building codes inside and out. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Jake, what's up? I need your help. Wendy Rothman reported my shed to code enforcement, and they're coming back tomorrow to document violations." Marcus let out a long whistle. "That woman is something else. What did the inspector say?" "He mentioned the permit issue and something about setbacks and height clearances. Can you come by today and take a look? Tell me how screwed I am. I can be there in an hour." True to his word, Marcus pulled up in his truck 60 minutes later with a toolbox and a thick binder of code regulations. We walked around the shed together while he measured, checked sight lines, and consulted his notes. "Okay, here's the deal," Marcus said, leaning against the shed. "Yes, you needed a permit. That's going to cost you some fees, but it's not the end of the world. Your setback from the rear property line is fine. You've got 18 feet and you only need 15. The height is under the maximum, so that's good too. The issue is going to be the side yard setback." "What do you mean?" "City code requires 5 feet from the side property line for accessory structures. You've got 4 feet and 8 inches. I closed my eyes. 4 inches. I'm 4 inches off technically, yes. But here's the thing, Jake. I've worked with code enforcement in Scottsdale for 15 years. Dan Rodriguez is reasonable. If everything else is in order and you're only 4 inches off on one measurement, he'll probably work with you. You might need to apply for a variance, but this isn't a tear-it-down situation. Relief flooded through me. So what do I do? Go to City Hall first thing Monday morning. Talk to the permitting office. Explain the situation, pay the permit fees, and start the variance process if needed. Be proactive. Show them you're trying to make it right. That goes a long way. We walked back toward the front yard, and that's when Marcus stopped suddenly, staring across the street at Wendy's house. Hey Jake, when was the last time Wendy had any work done on her property? I don't know. Why? Marcus was squinting at her house, his contractor's eye clearly spotting something. Because I'm pretty sure that covered patio she has wasn't there when this neighborhood was built, and that looks like it might be bigger than what you'd be allowed to build without permits. I looked at Wendy's house with new interest. She had a large covered patio extending from the back of her house, visible from the street because her lot was on a corner. It had a solid roof, ceiling fans, and what looked like electrical lighting. You think she didn't pull permits? I asked. I think it's worth checking. If she's going to report you for violations, she'd better make sure her own house is up to code. Something about the way Marcus said it made me pause. I wasn't usually a vindictive person, but Wendy had gone out of her way to cause me problems over a simple shed. Maybe it was time to level the playing field. That afternoon I did some research. Arizona has public records laws that make it relatively easy to search for permits and inspections. I went to the city website and looked up Wendy's address. What I found was interesting. Wendy's house had been built in 2002, part of the original Meadowbrook Estates development. She had pulled one permit in 2018 for a water heater replacement. Nothing else. No permits for the covered patio, which I could clearly see in Google Maps satellite images had been added sometime between 2019 and 2020. No permits for what looked like a significantly renovated garage. Nothing. I called Marcus back. You were right. No permits for the patio, or what looks like garage work. Want me to make some calls? I know a guy who does inspections. He owes me a favor. Let me think about it. I spent the rest of the weekend wrestling with my conscience. Part of me knew that reporting Wendy would just escalate things, but another part of me felt like she had started this fight and needed to understand that everyone's property could be scrutinized if that was the game we were playing. Monday morning came and I took the day off work to handle the permit situation. The city permitting office was in downtown Scottsdale, a modern building with too much glass and not enough parking. I spent 45 minutes in line before getting to speak with a clerk named Patricia. I need to apply for a retroactive permit for a shed, I explained, laying out the situation honestly. Patricia looked up my property in the system and nodded. I see code enforcement has already opened a case file. That's actually good for you because it means we can expedite this. The fee for a retroactive permit is double the normal rate, so that'll be $460. Plus you'll need to pay for a formal inspection, which is another $120. I handed over my credit card, wincing at the cost, but grateful it wasn't worse. Now, the inspector noted a potential setback issue, Patricia continued. You'll need to apply for a variance if the structure doesn't meet the 5-foot minimum. That's a separate process with the Board of Adjustment, and there's a hearing fee of $750. My stomach dropped. Seriously? Unfortunately, yes. The Board of Adjustment only meets once a month, so your hearing would be scheduled for June 25th. In the meantime, you'll need to prepare a site survey showing the exact measurements, photographs of the property, and a written statement explaining why you need the variance. I left City Hall significantly poorer and frustrated beyond measure. Wendy's little complaint was going to cost me nearly $1,500 in weeks of bureaucratic hassle. All over 4 inches that afternoon, as I was sitting in my backyard staring at the shed that had caused all this trouble, I made my decision. I pulled out my phone and called the Scottsdale Code Enforcement Office. Code Enforcement, this is Linda speaking. Hi Linda, I'd like to report some potential code violations at a property in my neighborhood. What's the address? 847 Meadowlark Drive, Scottsdale, 85260. I heard typing. And what violations are you reporting? There's a large covered patio structure that appears to have been built without permits, possible unpermitted garage modifications, and I think there might be some electrical work that wasn't inspected. The property owner is very concerned about code compliance in our neighborhood, so I'm sure she'd want to make sure everything is properly permitted. Linda's tone suggested she had heard the subtext loud and clear. We'll send an inspector out within the next week. Can I get your name and contact information? I provided my details and hung up. I didn't feel great about what I had done, but I also didn't feel terrible. Wendy had set the rules of engagement, and now we were playing by them. 3 days later, on Thursday morning, I was working from home when I heard a commotion outside. I looked out my window to see Dan Rodriguez, the same code enforcement officer who had inspected my shed, standing in Wendy's driveway with his clipboard. Wendy was following him around, and even from across the street I could see she was agitated. I probably shouldn't have, but I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on my front porch watching the show. Dan spent over an hour at Wendy's property. He measured the patio, took extensive photographs, went into her garage multiple times, and even brought out what looked like more specialized equipment. Wendy kept trying to talk to him, gesturing wildly, but Dan remained professional and focused on his inspection. Finally, he went to his truck, printed something from a portable printer, and handed Wendy several sheets of paper. Even from my porch I could see her face turn red. After Dan left, Wendy stood in her driveway looking at the papers in her hand. Then she looked directly at me. I raised my coffee cup in a slight salute. She stormed back into her house. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was Wendy. "You reported me to code enforcement," she said without preamble. "I reported a property that might have code violations," I said calmly. "Just like you did with mine. I figured if we're all concerned about following the rules, we should all be following the rules. This is harassment." "No, Wendy. This is exactly what you did to me." "How many violations did they find?" Silence. "Because I got hit for possibly 2 violations, both of which I'm fixing through the proper channels and spending over $1,000 to resolve. So I'm curious how many violations they found on your property." "That's none of your business." "Actually, it kind of is, since you're the HOA president and you're supposed to be setting an example for code compliance." "So how many, Wendy?" I heard her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. 9, she finally said. 9 alleged violations, which I'm going to dispute because that inspector clearly has no idea what he's talking about. 9 violations. I hadn't expected it to be that many, and despite my anger at Wendy, I felt a small twinge of guilt, but only a small one. "Well, I'm sure you'll get it sorted out," I said. "Through the proper channels, of course, just like I'm doing with my shed." She hung up on me. Over the next few days, word spread through the neighborhood about Wendy's code violations. It turned out that her covered patio had been built without permits and didn't meet setback requirements. Her garage had been converted into a workshop with electrical and plumbing work that had never been inspected. She had installed a water feature in her front yard that violated water restrictions. She had built raised garden beds that exceeded the height limit for front yard structures. Her fence was 6 inches too tall. She had replaced her water heater herself without a permit. She had enclosed her air conditioning unit with a decorative screen that restricted airflow below the minimum code requirements. She had added exterior lighting that wasn't properly grounded, and she had paved over part of her yard for additional parking without the proper drainage permits. 9 violations. Some were minor, some were significant, but together they painted a picture of someone who had been ignoring the same rules she loved to enforce on everyone else. The neighborhood was buzzing. People who had been on the receiving end of Wendy's HOA complaints over the years were particularly delighted. Tom Mitchell, who lived 3 houses down, had been fined by the HOA 2 years ago for having the wrong color mailbox. Sarah Coleman had gotten a violation notice for parking her car on the street overnight during Thanksgiving when her family was visiting. David Park had been forced to repaint his house trim because it was half a shade off from the approved color. Wendy had made a lot of enemies during her reign as HOA president, and now they were all watching her scramble to fix her own violations. I tried to focus on my own situation. The variance hearing for my shed was scheduled for June 25th, and I spent several evenings preparing my materials. Marcus helped me create a detailed site survey showing exactly where the shed sat on my property. I took photographs from every angle. I wrote a statement explaining that the 4-inch discrepancy was unintentional and that moving the shed would be impractical and expensive. Meanwhile, Wendy was scrambling to deal with her violations. I saw contractors at her house almost daily. Her patio was being modified. Work was being done in the garage. The fence was being cut down. It must have been costing her a fortune. The HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting for June 15th to discuss the situation. As a homeowner in the community, I had the right to attend, so I showed up at the community center at 7 in the evening along with at least 50 other residents. The room was packed. Wendy sat at the front table with the 4 other board members. Gregory Mills, the vice president, Helen Torres, the secretary, Patricia Freeman, the treasurer, and Michael Davidson, a member at large. They all looked uncomfortable. Gregory called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to address concerns that have been raised about recent code enforcement actions in our community and to discuss HOA leadership standards." A hand shot up immediately. It was Tom Mitchell. "I want to know how our HOA president can have 9 code violations on her property while she's been writing violation notices to the rest of us for years." The room erupted in agreement. Wendy's face was tight. I'm working to resolve those issues, Wendy said stiffly. They were honest mistakes and misunderstandings of code requirements. That's funny, Sarah Coleman called out. Because when I tried to explain that my overnight parking was a misunderstanding, you fined me $200. More agreement from the crowd. Gregory tried to restore order. Let's keep this civil. The board has discussed this situation, and we want to assure everyone that we take code compliance seriously for all residents, including board members. Then I move that Wendy Rothman be removed as HOA president, Tom said. She's proven she doesn't follow the same rules she enforces on everyone else. The room broke into chaos. People were shouting, some in support of removing Wendy, others arguing about proper procedure. Wendy looked like she was about to cry or scream, possibly both. Gregory banged a gavel on the table. We can't just remove a board member without following our bylaws. There's a process for this. I raised my hand and Gregory nodded at me. I'm Jake Nelson. I'm the one who reported the violations on Ms. Rothman's property, and I want to be clear about why I did it. I built a shed in my backyard without realizing I needed a permit. It's a minor oversight that I'm now paying over $1,000 to fix. Ms. Rothman reported me to code enforcement not because she was concerned about neighborhood safety or property values, but because she was angry that I installed solar panels despite her objections. This was retaliation, pure and simple. So yes, I reported her property in return. Maybe that makes me petty, but I think it's important that we all follow the same rules. If Ms. Rothman is going to be HOA president, she needs to hold herself to at least the same standard she holds the rest of us. There was applause. Wendy stood up. This is ridiculous. I have served this community for 6 years. I have worked tirelessly to maintain our property values and our neighborhood standards. I made some mistakes with my own property, and I'm fixing them. That should be the end of it. You made 9 mistakes, someone called out. 9 separate violations. That's not mistakes, that's hypocrisy. Gregory looked exhausted. Okay, here's what's going to happen. According to our bylaws, any board member can be removed by a vote of the membership. We'll need to schedule a special election. In the meantime, I'm going to suggest that Wendy step back from her enforcement duties and focus on resolving her code violations. Wendy looked like she'd been slapped. You're suspending me? I'm suggesting you recuse yourself from enforcement decisions until this is resolved. I won't resign, Wendy said firmly. No one's asking you to resign, Gregory said, though his tone suggested he probably wished she would. We're just asking you to step back temporarily. The meeting continued for another hour, with various residents airing grievances about HOA enforcement over the years. It became clear that Wendy had been heavy-handed in her approach, often interpreting rules in the strictest possible way and showing little flexibility for honest mistakes or temporary situations. By the time the meeting ended, a special election had been scheduled for July 20th to vote on whether to remove Wendy as HOA president. In the meantime, Gregory would take over her enforcement duties. I drove home feeling conflicted. I had started something that was now spiraling beyond my original intent. I had just wanted Wendy to back off my shed. Now she was facing removal from the HOA board. The next week, my variance hearing arrived. I took another day off work and showed up at City Hall with my binder full of documentation. The Board of Adjustment consisted of 5 citizens appointed by the City Council, and they sat at a long table reviewing my case materials. I presented my situation clearly and honestly. I explained that I had built the shed without realizing I needed a permit, that I was 4 inches short of the required setback, and that I was willing to do whatever was necessary to make things right. One board member, a retired engineer named Robert Fields, asked, "Mr. Nelson, could you move the shed 4 inches to meet the setback requirement?" "Technically, yes," I said, "but the shed is bolted to a concrete foundation, and moving it would require demolishing that foundation, rebuilding it, and potentially damaging the shed in the process. It would be expensive and wasteful when the current location isn't causing any problems for my neighbors." "Has anyone objected to the shed's location?" another board member asked. "Only the person who reported it, and that was not because of its location, but because of a personal dispute." The board deliberated for 15 minutes before calling me back in. "Mr. Nelson, the board has voted 4-1 to grant your variance," Robert Fields announced. "The 4-inch discrepancy is minor, and you've demonstrated good faith in trying to resolve this issue properly. Your permit will be approved pending a final inspection to verify the structure is safe and meets all other code requirements." I could have hugged them. "Thank you so much. We appreciate homeowners who work with us to resolve issues rather than fighting the process," Robert said. "Good luck with your shed." I left City Hall feeling like a massive weight had been lifted. My shed was legal. I had spent about $1,500 total between permit fees, variance fees, and the site survey, but it was done. That evening I saw Wendy outside supervising yet another contractor at her house. I walked over, probably against my better judgment. "Wendy, can we talk?" She looked at me with pure venom. "What do you want, Jake?" I wanted to let you know that my variance was approved. My shed is fully permitted and legal now. Congratulations, she said coldly. I also wanted to say that I didn't intend for things to go this far. I was angry when you reported me, and I reported you back. That was petty. I'm sorry this has blown up into such a big thing. Wendy was quiet for a long moment. You cost me over $30,000. I blinked. What? $30,000 to fix all the violations on my property. The patio had to be partially demolished and rebuilt to meet setbacks. The garage work had to be redone to pass inspection. The fence, the garden beds, the water feature, all of it. Plus the permit fees, the inspection fees, the contractor fees. $30,000 because you decided to be vindictive. Wendy, I didn't make you build all that stuff without permits. You did that yourself. I built it because I didn't think it mattered. These are my property, my choices. And that's exactly how I felt about my shed, I said. But you reported me anyway. Not because you cared about code compliance, but because you were angry about my solar panels. You cost me $1,500 in weeks of stress over 4 inches. I'm sorry your violations cost more, but you can't hold yourself to a different standard than everyone else. She turned away from me. Just leave me alone, Jake. I walked back to my house, not sure if I felt better or worse about the conversation. The special HOA election happened on July 20th, and it wasn't even close. Wendy was removed as HOA president by a vote of 83 to 12. She also chose not to run for re-election to the board at all, effectively ending her 6-year reign. Gregory Mills became the new HOA president, and one of his first acts was to announce a comprehensive review of all HOA rules and enforcement procedures. He formed a committee to recommend changes that would make the HOA less punitive and more focused on genuine community issues rather than nitpicking minor violations. Life in Meadowbrook Estates gradually returned to normal. Wendy kept to herself, and I rarely saw her outside. Her house was now fully compliant with all codes, which I had to admit looked quite nice. My shed was legal and functioning perfectly, storing all my equipment just as I had intended. About 2 months after the election in late September, I was mowing my lawn when I noticed a moving truck at Wendy's house. I watched over the next several hours as movers loaded furniture and boxes. By evening, the house was empty, and Wendy's car pulled out of the driveway for the last time. She was selling her house and leaving the neighborhood. I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me felt bad that things had ended this way. Part of me thought maybe this was the best outcome for everyone. Wendy would get a fresh start somewhere else, and Meadowbrook Estates would have a chance to develop a healthier HOA culture. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Wendy, forwarded from her old address. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. Jake, it read. I'm writing this from my new condo in Phoenix. No HOA here, just a building management company, which is a relief. I've spent the last few months thinking about what happened, and I owe you an apology. You were right that I reported your shed out of spite, not genuine concern about codes. I had convinced myself that I was protecting the neighborhood, but really I was just angry that I couldn't control everything. The truth is, being HOA president gave me a sense of purpose after my divorce, and I took it too far. I became the kind of person I wouldn't want to live next to. I'm sorry for the stress and expense I caused you. I'm also oddly grateful because you held up a mirror and forced me to see what I had become. I'm working on being better. I hope your shed serves you well for many years, Wendy. I read the letter twice and then tucked it into a drawer. It was more than I had expected from her, and it felt like closure. Gregory turned out to be an excellent HOA president. He implemented new guidelines that focused enforcement on issues that genuinely affected health, safety, or property values while giving homeowners more flexibility on minor aesthetic choices. He created a committee to help homeowners navigate permit processes instead of just reporting violations. He instituted a warning system for first-time minor violation instead of immediate fines. The neighborhood felt different. People seemed friendlier, less worried about being reported for every tiny infraction. Block parties started happening again. Kids played in the streets without parents worrying about someone complaining about noise. I kept my shed exactly where it was, 4 inches from perfection, but fully legal and functional. Every time I opened those doors to grab my lawnmower or camping gear, I thought about the whole saga. About how a simple storage shed had exposed years of HOA dysfunction. About how holding someone accountable for their own rules had cost that person $30,000 in their position of authority. About how sometimes standing up for yourself meant escalating conflict before things could get better. My solar panels continued to generate clean energy, saving me hundreds of dollars a year on electricity bills. The shed kept my equipment dry and organized. My grass stayed at the appropriate height, not because I feared HOA violations, but because I took pride in my property. One Saturday afternoon in October, I was in my backyard organizing the shed when my doorbell rang. I walked around to the front to find a woman in her early 40s standing on my porch. "Hi, I'm Jennifer Richards. I just bought the house across the street, Wendy's old place. I wanted to introduce myself to the neighbors." I shook her hand. "Jake Nelson, welcome to the neighborhood. I've heard some interesting stories about the previous owner and something about an HOA war over sheds." She was smiling. I laughed. That's one way to put it. It was a learning experience for everyone involved. "Well, I'm glad things have calmed down. I actually used to live in a neighborhood with a nightmare HOA, so I specifically asked the realtor about the situation here. She said the new HOA president has really turned things around. Gregory's great. Much more reasonable than the previous president." We chatted for a few more minutes, and I found myself feeling genuinely optimistic about the neighborhood's direction. New neighbors, new leadership, new attitudes. That evening, I grilled burgers in my backyard and sat on my patio watching the sunset. The shed stood quietly in the corner of my yard, unremarkable and functional, having survived the bureaucratic ordeal and emerged legal and proper. I thought about Wendy's letter, about her admission that she had become someone she wouldn't want to live next to. It was a powerful thing to acknowledge, and I respected her for it. I wondered if she was happier now in her Phoenix condo, free from the responsibility of enforcing rules on her neighbors. I also thought about my own actions. I had reported Wendy's violations out of spite, even if they were legitimate concerns. I had escalated the conflict when I could have tried to resolve things more diplomatically. I had contributed to her losing her position and ultimately leaving the neighborhood. Was I proud of that? Not entirely. But I also didn't regret standing up for myself when someone tried to use their authority to bully me. The whole experience had taught me something important about HOAs and community living in general. Rules are necessary, but they need to be applied fairly and reasonably. Authority should be tempered with empathy and flexibility. And people in positions of power need to remember that they're serving their community, not ruling over it. Gregory called me a few days later. "Jake, I wanted to give you a heads up. We're putting together a new architectural review committee, and I'd like you to be on it." "Me? Why?" "Because you understand the balance between following rules and being reasonable. You went through the permit process the right way, even when it was expensive and frustrating. But you also weren't afraid to point out when enforcement was being applied unfairly. That's the kind of perspective we need." I thought about it for a moment. "I'm not looking to become an HOA busybody." Gregory laughed. "Trust me, that's exactly why I want you. The busybodies are the problem. I need people who will review things fairly and focus on what actually matters. The committee only meets once a month, and it's mostly just approving routine stuff like paint colors and landscaping plans." "Okay," I said. "I'll do it." And that's how I ended up on the Meadowbrook Estates Architectural Review Committee, the same committee that Wendy had tried to use to block my solar panels. The irony wasn't lost on me. The first meeting I attended was in November. There were 5 of us on the committee, and we reviewed applications for everything from new fences to roof replacements to exterior remodeling projects. Gregory sat in on the meeting as HOA president. "First item," Gregory said, "is a request from the Martinez family on Bluebird Lane to install solar panels." I looked at the application. It was almost identical to what I had submitted 2 years ago. Same type of panels, same configuration. "These look fine to me," I said. "They meet all the technical requirements and they're not visible from the street." The other committee members agreed, and we approved it unanimously. It took less than 5 minutes compared to the 3-month battle I had faced with Wendy fighting my application at every turn. We worked through the rest of the agenda efficiently and fairly. A fence that was slightly taller than standard but necessary because the homeowner had a large dog. Approved with the condition that it be installed in the backyard only. A request to paint a house door red, which wasn't on the approved color list but looked tasteful in the photos. Approved with a note to update the color list. A plan to add a small greenhouse which met all setback and height requirements. Approved. After the meeting, Marcus called me. "Hey, I heard you're on the architectural review committee now. News travels fast. It's a small neighborhood. I think it's great. You'll keep them honest." "I just want to make sure people can enjoy their homes without unnecessary hassle," I said. "Within reason, of course. That's the balance. You know, I heard Jennifer Richards is planning some renovations on Wendy's old place. You might be reviewing her applications soon. As long as she pulls permits and follows the process, I don't see any problems." Over the following months, the Architectural Review Committee reviewed dozens of applications. We approved most of them, sometimes with minor modifications. We denied very few, and those were usually cases where someone wanted to do something that would genuinely create problems for neighbors, like building a structure that would block someone else's view or light. The committee developed a reputation for being fair and responsive. People stopped dreading the HOA and started seeing it as a helpful resource for navigating city codes and neighborhood standards. In March of the following year, I got another letter from Wendy. This one was shorter. Jake, I wanted you to know that I've been seeing a therapist to work through some of my control issues. She helped me understand that after my divorce, I was trying to control my environment because I couldn't control my personal life. Being HOA president let me feel powerful when I felt powerless. It wasn't healthy for me or fair to my neighbors. I'm working on being better. I also wanted to let you know that I've started volunteering with Habitat for Humanity, helping build homes for people who need them. It turns out I actually enjoy helping people improve their homes rather than punishing them for not meeting arbitrary standards. I hope you're well, Wendy. I smiled reading the letter. Growth and self-awareness were rare things, and I was genuinely happy for her. Life in Meadowbrook Estates continued peacefully. The new family across the street, the Richards, did indeed renovate their home. Jennifer came to me early in the process to discuss her plans, and I helped her navigate the permit requirements and HOA approval process. Her renovations turned out beautifully, and they increased property values on our street. My shed remained functional and legal, housing my lawn equipment, tools, and camping gear just as intended. The solar panels on my roof continued to generate clean energy and save me money. My grass stayed at an appropriate height because I cared about my property, not because I feared violations. The Board of Adjustment variance I had received became something of a precedent in Scottsdale. Other homeowners with minor setback issues were able to point to my case as an example of the city working reasonably with property owners who made honest mistakes and tried to fix them properly. Gregory served as HOA president for another 2 years before stepping down voluntarily, having accomplished his goal of reforming the organization's culture. The woman who replaced him, a retired teacher named Susan Walsh, continued his policies of fair and reasonable enforcement. I served on the Architectural Review Committee for 3 years before deciding I had done my part and it was time to let others serve. During that time, we approved hundreds of projects, denied fewer than 10, and helped countless homeowners navigate the sometimes confusing intersection of HOA covenants and city codes. Looking back on the whole saga, I realized that sometimes conflicts, even petty ones, can lead to positive change. My shed war with Wendy had exposed problems in our HOA that had been building for years. Her downfall, while painful for her, had ultimately made the neighborhood better for everyone. I also learned that standing up for yourself matters, even when it's uncomfortable or costly. If I hadn't pushed back against Wendy's vindictive complaint, she would have continued to abuse her authority. If I hadn't reported her violations, she never would have faced accountability for holding others to standards she didn't meet herself. But I also learned that grace and forgiveness matter. Wendy's letters showed genuine remorse and growth. She had made mistakes, faced consequences, and chosen to become better. That deserved acknowledgement and respect. One evening in late spring, I was sitting in my backyard with a beer, enjoying the pleasant Arizona weather before the brutal summer heat arrived. I looked at my shed, still standing exactly where I had built it, 4 inches from the property line, fully permitted and legal after a bureaucratic odyssey that had cost me money, time, and stress, but had ultimately been worth it. I thought about Wendy, hopefully thriving in her Phoenix condo and finding healthier ways to channel her energy. I thought about Gregory and the reformed HOA culture he had created. I thought about all my neighbors who could now enjoy their homes without living in fear of petty enforcement actions. And I thought about the strange path that had led from a simple backyard shed to neighborhood revolution. Sometimes the smallest things trigger the biggest changes. Sometimes standing your ground means everyone ends up on better ground. My phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Hey Jake, you want to come over for a barbecue this weekend? I'm inviting some of the neighbors." "Sure, sounds great." "Good. And hey, you should bring some burgers. You can store them in that fancy legal shed of yours until then." I laughed. "Never going to let me live that down, are you?" "Not a chance. That shed is legendary now. You know, people give tours of the neighborhood to potential buyers and point it out, the shed that reformed the HOA. You're making that up." "I'm absolutely not. Jennifer Richards told me that her realtor specifically mentioned it as a sign that the HOA had gotten better. Your shed is a selling point for the neighborhood." "That's ridiculous. That's reality. See you Saturday." I hung up and looked at the shed again, this time with amusement rather than frustration. My shed, a legend, a symbol of HOA reform, a selling point for the neighborhood. Sometimes life takes the strangest turns. Saturday came, and I loaded up the burgers and headed to Marcus's house. About 20 neighbors showed up, including Jennifer and her husband from across the street, Tom Mitchell, who had called for Wendy's removal at that fateful HOA meeting, Sarah Coleman, who had been fined for overnight parking, and a dozen others. We grilled food, drank beer, and told stories. Inevitably, someone brought up the shed saga. "I still can't believe Wendy had 9 violations, Sarah said, shaking her head. "After all the grief she gave everyone else, 9 violations that cost her $30,000 to fix," Tom added. That's got to be some kind of record. She did write me an apology letter, I mentioned. She's actually been working on herself. Therapy, volunteering with Habitat for Humanity, the whole thing. Good for her, Jennifer said. It takes guts to admit you were wrong and try to change. It does, I agreed. I'm glad she's doing better. Still, Marcus said with a grin, you have to admit the irony is perfect. HOA Karen reports your shed. Inspector finds 9 violations on her property instead. It's like something out of a movie. Everyone laughed and we moved on to other topics. But the story of the shed had become part of neighborhood lore. A tale told to new residents about the time the HOA went too far and got checked by one of its own. As the evening wound down and neighbors started heading home, I found myself talking with Gregory, who had shown up late after dealing with a minor HOA issue. You know, Jake, I never properly thanked you for what you did, Gregory said. What do you mean? Reporting Wendy's violations. I know it seems petty in retrospect, but it needed to happen. She had become toxic for the neighborhood, and nobody knew how to stop her. You did. You held her accountable in a way that was completely fair and legitimate. It gave the rest of us the courage to push for change. I mostly did it because I was angry, I admitted. Maybe, but anger at injustice is a valid response, and you channeled it into legitimate action rather than just complaining. That matters. We stood there in Marcus's backyard, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, and I realized Gregory was right. I had been angry, but I had used that anger constructively. I had followed the same process Wendy had used against me, applied the same scrutiny she had applied to others. The fact that it had exposed her hypocrisy wasn't my fault, it was hers. How are things with the HOA now? I asked. Better than they've been in a decade, Gregory said. Revilsion reports are down. Compliance is actually up because people want to maintain their properties, not because they're afraid of fines. We're getting more volunteers for committees and events. The whole culture has shifted. That's great to hear. And a lot of it traces back to your shed, Gregory said with a smile. The shed that changed everything. I drove home that night feeling content. My neighborhood was healthy, my HOA was functional and fair. My property was exactly how I wanted it, with my legal shed and my money-saving solar panels. The shed stood in my backyard, a humble 10 by 12 structure of wood and shingles, housing lawnmowers and camping equipment, sitting precisely 4 inches closer to the property line than code technically allowed but legally grandfathered in through a variance granted by reasonable people applying reasonable judgment. It was just a shed, but it had also been so much more. A catalyst for change. A test of principles, a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself means everyone ends up standing on firmer ground. I walked out to the shed one last time that night, unlocking the door and looking at the neatly organized contents. Everything in its place. Everything legal and proper. Everything exactly as it should be. I closed the door, locked it, and walked back to my house, leaving the legendary shed to stand quietly in the darkness. A monument to the time when Meadowbrook Estates learned that rules applied to everyone, or they applied to no one. And somewhere in Phoenix, I hoped Wendy was sleeping peacefully, having learned the same lesson the hard way, having paid her $30,000 tuition in the School of Humility and Fairness, having emerged from the experience as someone better than she had been. The shed remained. The neighborhood improved. Life went on. And sometimes that's the best ending anyone can ask for.